Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the globe. Thanks for joining us at the NCMC webinar series, the third of this year already. And today we're going to be covering the topic Now Women Do Ask, a call to update beliefs about the gender pay gap. So before we jump into today's session, just reminding what is the NCMC all about? Negotiation and conflict management collaborative. We really aspire to be a collaborative, not a center. We're not the center of anything. We just want to reach out and collaborate with as many people as possible to spread the word of good negotiation, sustainable negotiation and conflict management practices. So please feel free to reach out to us if you're looking for more resources or if you are looking to collaborate in any way or form. We really want to be a force for good, and we only can do that if we have multipliers. So thanks for joining, and thanks for being here today. So as the house rules, let's just reminding that everyone will be muted and video off. The chat box is only for host posting, so some resources will be posted at the end by YE. Useful info and links will be shared at the end of the webinar. With links there, we'll also present the slides with some QR codes, so have your phone ready if you prefer to just click on those. We're going to be presenting some of those later on. Q&A tab then will be for you to ask questions, so feel free to ask questions during our speaker's presentation today. If you don't have your own questions, please do go check and upvote, because we will normally have more questions than we have time. So we usually prioritize those that have the most number of votes. So upvoting is something that will help you get the best out of the session. And finally, the recording will be made available at a later date. So with that, let's actually jump straight to the main event. So in today, Now Women Do Ask, a call to update beliefs about the gender pay gap, we have the honor and the pleasure of having Professor Laura Kray, who is the Ned and Carol Speaker Leadership Chair and Professor at University of California, Berkeley Haas School of Business. Laura, thank you so much. The floor is yours. Feel free to put up your slides as I'm bringing mine down.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here today. Let me just pull up my slides and we'll dive right in. Let's see. Is that displaying correctly?
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. Okay. Well, greetings from this is a scene from Berkeley, pretty much the view I have from my office, but I'm actually here today in London, and I'm excited to have the opportunity to share this new work with you. So to begin, I wanted to share a statistic, a US centric statistic. Of course, these numbers vary across the globe. I just looked up the statistic for the UK because I gave this talk yesterday, and while the US gender wage gap is 83%, meaning women's median wages for full-time year-round work is 83% of men's wages. In the UK, apparently they're up to 97%. So it's amazing to see the progress that is being made here, in part due to legislation that they passed in 2017, mandating that companies disclose these gaps and address them. We've seen a little bit of backsliding in the US over the last 2 years. So this issue has never been more important from my perspective. Okay, so the question is, what causes this pay gap? How do we account for this? On the one hand, you can see this is a slide from a report that McKinsey and Lean In put out, showing the sort of distribution of men and women broken down by whether they're white or people of color at various levels in the corporate hierarchy. And what you can see is that where men and women start off with relative parity at entry level, by the time they rise to the C-suite, if they rise to the C-suite, we see significantly more men and fewer men of color compared to white men. And so, going back to the statistic of the gender pay gap, one simple explanation is that there are simply more men at the top where pay is higher, right? And so we call that vertical segregation. And so that is one obvious contributor to the pay gap, but it's not the only explanation. So there's, this is an interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary topic, And, economists, sociologists, psychologists, you name it, have been studying this problem from a number of different angles. So I'll just briefly cover, a range of perspectives before we dive into the focus of today, which is about negotiating differences. And so on the one hand, we can talk about supply side differences. This is, sort of what men and women bring to the labor market. And in the past, it has been shown that men may have had more educational attainment that they were bringing to the table. That's no longer true today in the United States. In fact, we see women graduating from college and graduate schools at the same rate or higher than men. But this traditionally has been one explanation. Claudia Goldin and her colleagues, so Claudia Goldin is a Nobel Prize winning economist for her work on women's careers, has also attributed just that men tend to work more hours than women do, and that those extra hours have exponential impact on compensation. We also know that men and women tend to sort into different kinds of jobs. And so some of those jobs that men may be more inclined to sort into tend to be higher paying jobs. So one example would be science, technology, engineering, and math, what we call STEM fields. And so that could possibly explain this gender pay gap as well. Other economists, Niederle and Westerlund, have also found that men tend to prefer competitive payoff schemes. So, working in competition with your peers, and if you end up with being the most productive, then you get the sole lion's share of compensation. And so men will opt into payment schemes like that at a higher rate than women will, where they're finding that women tend to prefer that everybody be paid equally depending upon what their productivity is. And so we can, again, think of these as supply side explanations. On the other hand, there's also some evidence of what we call demand side explanations. And so this is what we would traditionally think of as discrimination or unfairness. Linda Babcock and colleagues have done some really interesting work showing that women tend to be assigned more non-promotable tasks at work. And so these are tasks that are by definition important for the organization. Somebody needs to do it. Someone needs to write this report, but it's not the type of work that's actually going to get you promoted. And so if women are doing more of this work as opposed to the work that's more highly valued within the organization, then that could lead to lower compensation. We also know that men and women, some evidence suggests that women are held to higher standards for promotion. So whereas men might be promoted based on potential, women have to actually have a proven track record in order to earn the promotion. And then in some work that I did with Margaret Lee, what we found is that, if we looked at that hierarchy that I showed you just a minute ago, that even when men and women are at the identical level of a corporate hierarchy, their jobs tend to take on different characteristics. And one in particular is that men tend to have a greater what we call span of control. They tend to have more direct reports. So they have more, sort of staffing to help them do their job than women do. And what we find is that the number of direct reports that you have is a signal of your job importance and job difficulty. And people will say, and we find in our data, that the more direct reports somebody has, the higher their compensation tends to be. So this is all just to say the gender pay gap is complex. There are a lot of contributing factors, but what I want to focus on today is negotiating. And so let me start with this quote here, which is basically says, women don't ask. They don't ask for raises and promotions and better job opportunities. They don't ask for recognition for the good work they do. They don't ask for more help at home. In other words, women are much less likely than men to use negotiation to get what they want. And this is a quote from a very influential book in our field that came out around the turn of the century, so about a little over 20 years ago, that has had enormous impact. And so I think it's important to look at this explanation and see if it still holds true today. And to the extent that it is outdated, maybe things have changed over the last 20, 25 years. What are the implications for still endorsing this belief that women are paid less than men because they don't negotiate? Okay, so the theoretical model that we're going to be testing today is as follows. So we know that men are paid more than women on average. Um, the theory is that one reason for this is that women have a lower propensity to negotiate than men do, or men have a greater propensity to negotiate, and that when we control for this, when we account for this, that explains the direct link between gender and compensation. Okay, so and what my research is doing is putting a question mark around that first link between gender and negotiating propensity. So here we have some evidence in the literature. Hannah Bowles from Harvard and colleagues did a big review of the literature on gender and negotiation. And what they found is the following. A person's gender is not a reliable predictor of their negotiation behavior or outcomes because the degree and character of gender dynamics in negotiation vary across situations. So in other words, it's not the case that we just see what we call main effects, where men are always one way and women are always another way. Instead, it's a lot more subtle than that. And so specifically, when we dig into the literature, a couple of subtleties that really make a difference can be gleaned from meta-analyses. So meta-analyses take the entire literature looking at gender and negotiation propensity or gender and negotiation outcomes and see, are there circumstances where a gap emerges and other circumstances where that gap closes out? And so because they find heterogeneity in the size of the gap between men and women, what we call effect sizes, then that means that the situation matters. And so let me just share with you two situational moderators that really influence whether men and women end up with identical outcomes in negotiations. The first is negotiating experience. So, in this work, the researchers doing this meta-analysis were able to take all of the literature and look at, well, who was the population that they were studying? And what they found is that the only time they saw gender differences in negotiation outcomes was among undergraduate research participants who said they'd never done any negotiation before in their life, either in the lab or in real life. So if we're talking about MBA students, if we're talking about working adults, they were not finding gender differences. Secondly, is situational ambiguity. Right. So when you're in a situation where you don't know if it's appropriate to negotiate, you don't know if this is negotiable, that's when they were finding a slight advantage for men over women. Men were more likely to take the risk of trying to negotiate when it was ambiguous whether it was appropriate, whereas women held back slightly more when it was ambiguous. However, when it was obvious that this is a negotiation, then no gender differences emerged. And so when we think about something like a job negotiation, a salary negotiation, those are sort of prototypical contexts of low situational ambiguity, right? We all know that's a situation where we're likely to be expected to negotiate. So under those circumstances, they were not seeing negotiation differences. So again, that link between gender and negotiation propensity sort of gets cut off when people have experience and when ambiguity is low. Okay, so that calls into question, right, the simplicity of the model. And so now I want to look and just share with you, again, I mentioned Claudia Golden. She won the Nobel Prize in economics just a few years ago for having advanced our understanding of women's labor market outcomes. And so in a seminal piece of work of hers, what they did is they tracked MBA students out of the University of Chicago, Booth School of Business, and they created a panel data set where they tracked each graduate's salaries, compensation over 13 years after they graduated from the MBA program. And there are a number of things that we see here. First of all, we see overall men are making more than women, which is what the gender pay gap is. Secondly, we see that the gap grows over time, right? As people gain experience, it gets larger as opposed to when they're right out of business school. And then the third thing worth noting is that the gap is greatest among people who are at the highest end of the income distribution. Right. So if we're talking about people who've been out for 10 plus years and they are making, here we see the numbers are, $800,000 a year. These are highly experienced people. So these would be people where we wouldn't expect to see a negotiating gap. So where the gap is the greatest in pay, that's where we already know that, we're not seeing evidence that men and women negotiate differently. And so other evidence to call into question whether the gender pay gap can be explained by negotiating propensity. This is a survey that was done by McKinsey and Lean in 2017. They had over 70,000 respondents across over 200 companies, and they just asked people point blank, did you negotiate for your last raise? Did you negotiate for your last promotion? And they broke it down by gender and then race and ethnicity. And what you can see is that just focusing on gender, there really are no differences, right? No statistically significant differences. If anything, there's a slight uptick for women reporting more negotiation attempts than men. They replicated this again in 2018, broke it down in finer grained subcategories. And again, what you see is that, if anything, there's a slight, very slight uptick in women attempting more negotiations than men. And then more recently, some work that came out of Australia, a nationally representative survey out of Australia, did in fact find that women are asking for raises as often as men, but they're being told no more often. And so their data, this is, I have asked for a pay raise, yes or no. And this is, nearly 5,000 respondents across 840 workplaces. And what you can see is that there's no statistically significant difference between having asked. So they're asking at the same rate, but where things are breaking down is that women are less likely to say that they were successful in negotiating since joining their current company. So what we wanted to do in our research was replicate and extend this. So we think that there's some preliminary evidence here to suggest that women are asking, they're not getting. And so that suggests that the explanation for the pay gap cannot be that women simply aren't negotiating. And so if we continue to believe this, then what are the consequences? So I'm going to show you data that we collected from an elite business school in the US that replicates and extends this earlier work. We're going to dig into the literature and unpack those meta-analyses to really hone in on the data that speak directly to people self-reporting whether they negotiated or not for their promotions and raises. We're going to look at how endorsement of stereotypes, believing that men are one way and women are another, may be promoting this belief that women don't ask. And if we believe that this is true when in fact it's not, does it cause any harm? And so we're going to explore how these beliefs sort of correlate with and cause people to lose support for structural interventions that have proven to be effective at reducing the gender pay gap. So I'll explain that more to you when we get to it. Okay, so the first study that I want to share with you, and I'm not going to go into all the details here, but we recruited almost 300 people in an online nationally representative poll. These people had over 20 years work experience on average. So again, highly seasoned professionals. They were told that, we conducted a survey of men and women in an MBA program and asked them whether they negotiated their job offer. So we want you to estimate how many men and how many women answered affirmatively. Okay. And we gave them, we paid them, if they were accurate, they got bonus payment. So we financially incentivized them to think carefully about the question. And where we drew, ground truth from, and we told them this specifically, is that this business school was asking their graduates upon graduation whether they had negotiated their job offer, yes or no. We had over nearly 1,000 students between the years 2015 and 2019. We described the population generally. And then we asked them, again, they were asked the question, did you negotiate your offer? And they were given the choice of saying yes or no. What percentage of men and what percentage of women do you think answered affirmatively? So not surprisingly, people thought that 64% of men answered affirmatively that they negotiated their job offer, and people thought that only 47% of women did. That's a statistically significant large effect size in terms of what people believe. Now let's compare that to reality, which is what those MBA graduates actually told us, told the Career Services Office. And what you see here is that, in fact, 54% of women answered affirmatively and only 44% of men did. So there's a gap between expectations and reality. We also asked them, we said we also have another data set that we want you to estimate. And this is a data set of nearly 2,000 alums from this elite business school. And they graduated between 1990 and 2018. These data were collected by an outside consulting firm. And among this population, there's a pay gap where women are earning 22% less than men. So just right about where we see the national average in the US. And what we did is we gave them the identical questions in the survey with the alumni. They were asked the identical questions from the arts paper that I mentioned out of Australia. And so what the alumni were asked is, which of the following actions have you taken in relation to your compensation since you commenced your employment with your current employer? So, they could say, I was just given a better wage without even pursuing it. I was given a better wage through a promotion. I was given a better wage through negotiation. Or he said, I tried to get a better wage by applying for a promotion, but I was unsuccessful. I tried to get a better wage through negotiation, but was unsuccessful. Or I have not attempted to attain a better wage. And I've not attempted to get a promotion. So they could check off any one of these that applied. And so what you can see in terms of the estimated propensity, again, this is our nationally representative poll asking people to guess how many men and women answered affirmatively. And in a nutshell, people think that men tried more negotiations and were more successful at negotiations. People think that women were more passive, inactive in negotiating, and conditional on trying, they were less likely to be successful. Now let's compare that to reality. So what we see here is a stark, lack of differences. In fact, the only difference that emerges that is statistically significant is that women were more likely to say that they had tried to negotiate but were unsuccessful. Okay, so, and you can also see that people think that there's a lot more negotiating attempts going on than in fact people are reporting having done. So this sort of replicates the arts finding, and so gives us, again, further indication that the story that women don't ask and that's why they're not paid is perhaps overly simplistic. Okay, so now I'm going to dive into this meta-analysis that I mentioned to you that shows overall differences in the initiation of negotiation. And in the abstract here, you can see that they report a Hedges G, which is an indicator of the effect size of 0.2, which is a small effect size, but one that is overall significant, indicating that men are initiating more negotiations than women. And that's just a summary table from theirs where we can see that. And that's based on 55 different studies with almost over 17,500 participants. Now, what we realized in looking at this, however, is that there are a lot of different kinds of studies that they're combining to arrive at this estimate. And so if you look at the bottom of this where it says initiation of negotiation measure, So some of the studies measured actual behavior. People were doing a role play. Some of the studies were retrospective or prospective, meaning, asking to report on something they did in the past or something they intend to do in the future. Some of the studies were scenario vignettes. Imagine you're in this situation. Would you negotiate? And some were just dispositional. So how assertive are you? And so what we wanted to do was just pull out the studies that are most comparable to this yes, no, did you negotiate or not among real working adults. And so when we do that, we home in on the retro and prospective studies. These are all of them that they included. But you can even see among these, some of these are surveys where they ask, when's the last time you negotiated anything? Versus, some are what we're really looking for, which is the self-reported negotiation salary. So that cohort 2x2 event. So we're going to further pull out the ones that are most comparable, which still leaves us with over 5,000 respondents and 59% of that overall sample of retrospective, prospective studies. And when we do that, we find that the Hedges G drops to almost zero. It's not statistically significant. We then took the next step of reconstructing the raw data here. And what you can see is that when we just look at study by study, how many men were in it, how many women, what were the proportion of men who said they negotiated, what were the proportion of women, and then we just add this all up and look for the difference. In fact, what we see is that women are reporting more negotiation attempts, not less than men. Okay. And then what we thought is that maybe it's important to look across time because it might have been the case that in the distant past, men were negotiating more than women, but now we see women negotiating more than men. And that's in fact what we found when we pull out and we just plot men's trend over time and women's trend over time. You can see up until about 1992, men were negotiating more than women. And then between about 1992 and 2017, there was no statistically significant difference. And in the last decade or almost decade, we see women are sort of pulling ahead of men. And again, this is consistent with trends that we're seeing in educational attainment, et cetera. So this tells us that the belief that women don't ask and therefore they don't get is perhaps outdated. So the next steps in the few minutes I have remaining, I wanted to, explore with you just, what we've done to try and understand why this belief is being maintained and what its consequences are. So in this study, we asked the so what question, right? So people think that this is true, but we're not seeing that it is. What are the consequences? And so in a nutshell, we recruited almost 450 people. We asked them to tell us why they think the gender pay gap exists. And we looked at different kinds of explanations, supply side and demand side. So the choice-based explanations are supply side, the fairness explanations are demand side. And then we introduced this new explanation of negotiating propensity. And then we looked at the extent to which people believe that negotiating explains it. What impact does that have on their support for what's called a salary history ban, which is basically telling employers they can't ask employees what their prior salary was and base their current salary on that number. Because if women were discriminated against in the past and you use this as the basis for today's salary, then it just carries the discrimination forward. Okay, so we asked people to allocate, 100% of the pay gap. Which of these factors do you think is contributing? It had to add up to 100%. And so here are the examples of the choice-based. Maybe just women aren't going for it. They're not as ambitious. They're not working as many hours. They're less qualified. The fairness, this is like there's an old boys network, there's a penalty for working mothers, there's a glass ceiling, and then we have the negotiation explanations. Women don't negotiate effectively, they don't negotiate terms when they receive an offer, and they don't ask for better pay. So what we see here is that regardless of whether we ask them about the general population or an elite MBA population, across the board, people attribute the pay gap primarily to these demand side explanations of fairness. But the second most popular explanation is this negotiation gap. And then thirdly, there are choice-based explanations get some support as well. So then what we did is we looked at each individual and how they allocated, their understanding of what's causing the pay gap and how that impacted their support, again, for this Paycheck Fairness Act that actually was passed in the US Congress in 2022. And this is the exact text from it that basically says exactly what I indicated earlier, that, you can't ask people what their prior salary was. And we asked people, do you oppose or support this legislation? Would you be willing to sign a petition supporting this legislation? That was our dependent variable. And what you can see here, especially when they're thinking about what causes the pay gap for the MBA population, we'll just focus on that in the interest of time, the bottom half, is that not surprisingly, if people think that the pay gap is due to women's choices, then they're less supportive of a salary history ban. If they think that the pay gap is due to fairness, discrimination, then they're more supportive of the legislation. And critically, when people think that the pay gap is due to women's failure to ask, then they're less supportive of the salary history ban. And we can see that here. Okay, and the last study I want to share with you, so that's correlational. We wanted to show that believing women don't ask actually causes people to endorse these choice-based and negotiation-based explanations to a greater extent. And so what we did is we recruited, 356 participants. We gave them the text of the book Women Don't Ask versus a control condition, which was a book, Mind and Heart of the Negotiator. They read it, contemplated it, and then we asked them, we gave them a standard measure of stereotype endorsement, which I'll show you in a minute. And then we asked them what they believe causes the gender pay gap. Okay, so I'm going to, in the interest of time, I quoted this at the beginning, a portion of it. It's basically explaining that women don't ask. It actually goes on to say things are changing and people are starting to see negotiations as more collaborative. But the bottom line message is that men are initiating negotiations more than women are. In the control condition, it emphasizes that it's important to negotiate. Here are the reasons why. So in a pretest, we found that both passages equally emphasize the importance of negotiating. Only one frames it in terms of this gender gap and the other one doesn't. So then they were asked, after reading it, to rate the average man and the average woman with each other on a number of characteristics. And this is the scale that they based it on. And these are the characteristics that they rated. And so we know that those on the left-hand column are stereotypically feminine traits, and those on the right are stereotypically masculine. And so what we hypothesized is that when people start thinking of this gender gap in negotiating propensity, they're going to come to see men and women as in more stereotypical terms. And that's in fact what we found. Both men and women alike, our participants, were endorsed more stereotypes, saw men as more assertive and women as more nurturing when they read the Women Don't Ask passage compared to when they read the Mind and Heart of the Negotiator passage. And subsequently, again, they were asked to do that same task that I showed you earlier and tell us what explains the gender pay gap. They were given a number of choice-based, fairness-based, and negotiation-based explanations. And what you can see here is that, if we look on the far right, initially, perhaps not surprisingly, when they just read a passage about gender differences in negotiating propensity, they saw that as a bigger contributor to the gender pay gap than when they read the control essay. But what I think is most disturbing is that it also had a carryover, a spillover effect, leading people to also endorse to a greater extent explanations like, women aren't putting in as much work or they're not as ambitious. So we think that believing that women don't ask, which had been true in the past, but no longer is perpetuating stereotypes and causing, sort of harmful effects in terms of not seeing women's choices as being a bigger contributor. So if not negotiation propensity, then what? I will just leave you with a couple of examples of work that I think paints a broader brush that, and invite your reactions. So we know that, for example, if women are just worse negotiators, we saw that they were attempting more negotiations, but getting more, failed negotiations, not getting to yes, then we should see that across the board. But in work by Jen Daniels and Maggie Neal and others, what they found is that women's negotiations only end in impasse at a greater rate than men's when women have really strong BATNAs. So when they are high power. So high power women are getting told no more often than high power men. But when they're, relatively low power, there's no gender gap. And that's consistent with a whole literature on backlash against high power women. In some new work by Wang and Adina Sterling out of Columbia, they're finding that in an online marketplace that women are actually being given lower opening offers in salary negotiations than men are. And as I mentioned earlier, some of my work is showing that, as organizations negotiate, who reports to whom and what does the size of your team look like, men are accumulating more human resources around them that not only helps them to get their job done, right, but it is perceived as a more difficult and challenging job that people expect should be more highly compensated. And that's what we're finding in our data, that the number of direct reports people have does in fact predict greater compensation. So just to summarize, among MBA graduates, women are negotiating more, not less than men. And this is in a population where a sizable pay gap exists that disadvantages women. So it can't be the case that the gap exists because women simply aren't asking. And holding the belief that women don't ask may be serving to maintain the status quo, and reducing support for innovative policy interventions that are in fact proving to reduce the gender pay gap. So I will leave you at that. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Laura, thank you so very much. This was very illuminating, and it's fascinating when research starts finding new ideas and showing those last 40 years where women are asking more. That might be a result of research actually influencing behavior at a wider level. And that alone is a small measure of success, for academics like you who've been in that field for so long. And now finding what's the next step that should be done and changing that strategy is fundamental for course correction. So this was extremely helpful for me, at least, because I'm also passionate about the topic. I've actually published a few articles even back in 2006. So something that came to me. So let me actually give the floor to our participants who've been listening, and they've asked already a lot of questions. So this is time for you, all participants, to read the questions if you want to upvote on your preferred ones. But there's one here that seems to be a clear winner so far. So I'm going to start with that one to get us warmed up. So that one came really early in the presentation, which was, does gender pay gap worsen for women who become mothers? What can be done to address this, be it at an institutional level or as a mother negotiating for their compensation?
Yeah, right. So there's a lot of work that has been done on what's called the motherhood penalty. And that is this idea that, if let's say you're a hiring manager and you know that a prospective employee, intends to start a family right now or has a small family, young children at home, that people will say, that they want to, that person is probably less committed to their job and therefore less deserving of compensation. I will say that, some of the more recent work that I've done with Ann Harrison, an economist who was our former dean at Berkeley, what we're finding in one of these alumni salary surveys, a large scale one that was conducted in 2022, when we look at parental status among our alums, women who are mothers are in fact earning more than women who are not mothers, controlling for a whole host of factors. And so I think that there is, I think that the motherhood penalty is real, but I think it might be isolated to a particular career stage. So the reality is that the vast majority of women over their lifetimes do become mothers. And when you're talking about, postmenopausal woman, let's say, who has children who may be out of the home, I don't think that penalty still applies. In fact, there may be a pay premium because people perceive that person as, having her act together, right?
Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah.
So this was the good news, though, right? So that the penalty is not as high or big as we thought as first,
I
right?
think
When the
there's some.
first idea of the motherhood penalty came about, okay, let's move on. More questions then for you. Let me do a quick refresh to make sure I'm not okay, not cutting the line here. So the next most voted question was there any work done in identifying what men and women consider a better wage? Could it be that women did not negotiate toward the same pay levels as men did? I'm not sure
Yeah,
if that's
absolutely. You
okay.
can
Please go
imagine
ahead.
that, again, and if we use the example of a mother with a couple young children at home, maybe what she's prioritizing is flexible work, the ability to work remotely, limited travel schedule. All of that could be true. We don't have those data in our data sets. I did try to address this in the paper. We also, what I did is I analyzed a case in the MBA classroom. It's called Name Your Price, and it's a case out
Mm.
of Harvard. And this is based on a real MBA student at Harvard who was given a job offer in the healthcare industry and was told to craft their offer. They had to ask for what they wanted in salary, in bonuses, and incentive pay. And then they had to, sort of construct a cover letter that justified what they were asking for. And so I analyzed like 450 MBA students, executive MBA students, and looked at what they were asking for. And we found virtually no difference between what men and women were asking for in this case. So I don't, it doesn't rule out the possibility that in real life people are bringing in other issues. But at least, when we're comparing apples to apples, the identical situation, men and women are not asking for different things.
Okay. So refreshing once again. So let me move on to the next question. And there's a second to that question. So I would also be interested in knowing if there is any difference in negotiation length. My personal experience being that there is a lot of resistance brought against initializing a negotiation. And the second one, the build-up question from another guest here is how to make that negotiation then happen when the counterparty does not want to initiate.
Okay, so in terms of negotiation length, I'm inferring that what Kirsten is asking is whether maybe women gave up more easily. Is that, sort of?
Yeah, I don't know. Like I remember also seeing research where if interviews were a little longer, minorities and women did better than if they were shorter because they had more chances to explain how their background was different from the mainstream background of the
Ah,
legacy gender.
okay.
So it could be
Yeah.
that as well. So I'm not sure. I don't know if
Yeah.
Kirsten wants to add on
We
some.
don't
Oh, she
have those
goes.
data. Oh, go
She
ahead.
actually wrote down more about getting more pushback to starting a negotiation. Good. Thank you, Kirsten.
Yeah, and that could be reflected in what we saw, which is that women are saying, I tried, but I failed. And so it could
Mm-hmm.
be that, they're being dismissed out of hand, right? Like, you don't,
Yeah.
I'm not even going to give you the time of day. The data that we have are quite limited in terms of it's just yes or no, but that's where, really before I retire, whenever I retire, I really want to be a fly on a wall in these hiring negotiations so I can actually see what is transpiring. And if anybody out there would like to welcome me into your organization to observe how these negotiations take place, I would welcome the opportunity. But yeah, I think that's an important, question to
Yeah.
pursue.
And the follow up was, and so how do you try to any negotiation tips to make it happen when you're being rejected or resisted to initiate something?
Yeah, well, I
More
mean,
prescriptive
there
not
has to
done.
be a sense of urgency, right? A sense of, we're going to always tell you, you want to develop strong alternatives before you go to the bargaining table. So if you're able to say, I'm weighing this offer with another offer that I have that is set to expire, at the end of this week, then that's going to motivate people to come to the table. You always want to frame this discussion in terms of, your desire to better understand the needs of your counterpart, right, your prospective employer, so that they are, it's the carrot carrot as opposed to the stick, right? You want to incentivize them to come to the table because they feel like by having this discussion, you're going to be optimizing, the terms of your employment to make sure that you are meeting their needs, right? So I think there's some psychology to it, as well as, again, just being prepared, having alternatives, not ambushing people, giving them a heads up of the discussion you're hoping to have, and really appealing to, the relationship.
Thank you. I second that. So next question. Could you please elaborate a bit more on why powerful women are punished more, get more refusals, and what to do about it?
Yeah. So, I ran through that study where I showed you the stereotypes, the masculine and the feminine stereotypes, right? So people tend to think that women are more communal, more nurturing, more giving. People tend to think that men are more assertive and rational and et cetera. And it turns out that stereotypes are not just descriptive, like this is how I see men and this is how I see women. They're also prescriptive, which means this is how you should be, right? Women should be
Yeah.
nurturing and giving and caring. And if you are high powered, right, and assertive and demanding of, you're leveraging your power, that can violate people's expectations of how women should be. And so we tend to punish people who violate gender role expectations, right? We say, she may be really good at her job, but I wouldn't want to work with her. So there tends to be a likability penalty. And so it could have been in those negotiations when women had the better alternative, they had the leverage in the negotiation. They might have been, saying exact same thing that the men were saying when they had the high power. But for men, there's no inconsistency between the behavior and people's stereotypical expectations. So they, kind of go hand in hand. Whereas for women, there's this, catch 22. It's like if you're don't act powerfully, then you're not going to, then you're not going to reap the benefits of this strong alternative. But if you do act powerfully, then people are going to punish you. So it creates this catch 22.
Exactly. Thank you. Moving on to the next one. Are these themes common in both developed and emerging markets, global South, global North? Does culture have an impact on these negotiations on pay gap?
Yeah, I mean, I will start by just saying more work needs to be done on this systematically. I mean, there's certainly plenty of work on culture and cultural variation to suggest that cultures matter. So that is a given. And then when you layer on like gender role stereotypes across cultures, I do think that it likely has an impact. So in more developed countries, there's some evidence to suggest that people, ironically, where you think, oh, in a very developed country, people have a lot of freedom and shouldn't have to conform to the stereotypes. But we actually do see some evidence of greater stereotype endorsement than in more developing countries where, gender role, like everybody chips in and everybody does the work that's available, as opposed to, women do this and men do that. So it's sort of this paradox in a way that
Okay.
that in some cultures where you would think they'd be more egalitarian, they're actually more different. So, but yeah, I mean, go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead. Thought you were
No,
done.
no, I was just going to say that again, I like this is just a really important direction for future research and
Yeah.
complicated. You need to get to all these different countries and cultures. And I know INSEAD is the perfect place to, sort of gather data like that. But
We
yeah, we
probably
don't
have
have
at least 50 nationalities going on over here. Yes. And so,
amazing.
and I was jumping in because I got too excited because one of the things is because I have a legal training. So institutions so would you argue, I don't know if you have any, even a hint or a feel for that. And sorry, I'm jumping with my own question. I'm taking advantage of this. I normally don't do that, but I got too excited. And so basically you mentioned about the culture, egalitarian, developing economics. How about the institutional appreciation of the gender issue? Like, does it seem like some countries make more of an effort, others less? And do you see if that makes any difference across countries?
Yeah, I mean, even as I began just citing the difference in the overall gender wage gap between the US and the UK, like that suggests that, the UK has been, really trying to make progress on this and tracking it and encouraging transparency, et cetera. And so, that suggests a greater commitment than, in the US where we're sort of stalled out right now, if not backpedaling a little bit. So, and I think within organizations, we know that the more male dominated the organization is, then the more, you're probably going to see these challenges for women trying to rise up and trying to negotiate than in organizations that are more gender balanced. So I think definitely, just like, when I started and said gender differences, there's a lot of heterogeneity in effect
Yeah,
sizes. And so, the researchers in that paper focused on experience and situational ambiguity, but we could say, culture, whether it be
yeah,
or organizational culture or uh, the country culture would make a difference.
wonderful. Well, thanks for elaborating on that. So next question. Uh, my mind is blown. False belief that women don't ask perpetuates so much bias. I'm an exec career coach and worked a lot on salary negotiation with women. Other than the usual reads, Chris Voss never split the difference. What else do you recommend, Laura, to improve our approach and preparation?
Yeah, I teach negotiations to executives, and I always assign Deepak Malhotra and Max Bazerman's book, Negotiation Genius. That's a real high level book that, gives very tangible advice on how to prepare effectively. A more sort of introductory text is the one that I cited, Mind and Heart of the Negotiator by Lee Thompson. I think that's a really valuable text as well, just to introduce core concepts and help people to think systematically about how to prepare. Jean Brett has books on culture and negotiation that I love. And so, I mean, there's off the top of my head, those are three, but there's a lot. Debbie Kolb is a researcher scholar who's done a lot of work on gender, who's published on gender and negotiation.
So let me do a shameless. Today I'm all about shameless. A shameless two-way advertising. So there's also my book, Value Negotiation, which is really trying to push that win-win border. So if you would like to take a little bit of a different approach from Chris Voss, which is more on the win-lose power approach, you want to do more of the win-win that Laura was mentioning as well, the carrot less the stick, then you might want to take a look. Value Negotiation by me. Shameless advertising. I normally don't do that, but I'm getting all excited again today, so I'm just doing for it. So again, I think we have room for one or two more questions, and I want people to be able to enjoy that. So what's the next one in my list is, how do you make a negotiation happen in this condition? When being told your expectations are above market, when you know they're not, and above market really means not expected from you.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, you can't you can't force someone to see your value if they're disinclined to do so, right? I mean, if someone is telling you that, right? I mean, you can, focus on objective criteria, right? Like getting to yes, separate the people from the problem, objective criteria, seek options for mutual gain. So you can try all of this, but at the same time, I mean, if what you're hearing is somebody does not see your value, then you need to be prepared to walk away, right? But you can also, I mean, this is where it takes a village, right? And so it's really important to have other people who are willing to advocate on your behalf. And so even in my, professional life with on faculty, at Berkeley, I mean, we're not above, saying, hey, the two of you go to the dean's office and advocate on my behalf, would you? And,
Mm.
we really work together. And sometimes, especially for women, again, butting up against the stereotype that women are supposed to be giving and nurturing, et cetera, that creates more of a tension and conflict than it does for men to advocate on their own behalf. And so that's where if you have strong allies and people who are willing to make the case of what the value you're bringing to the table, then that could be a, sort of a workaround.
Thank you. Still a lot more. Let me. Is there any data on whether the negotiation outcome varies depending on the gender of the person across the negotiation table? So, for when a woman is deciding, i.e., when a woman is deciding on the salary.
Yeah, so Hannah Bowles and Linda Babcock have a paper on social incentives to negotiate showing this backlash effect, and they found that women incur more backlash for trying to negotiate hard when their counterpart is a man as opposed to a woman. So, that is one data point to suggest that and the idea is that it might be especially threatening to men, right? Like if men are, sort of the advantage group in the gender hierarchy and a woman is asserting, her claim on resources, that may have greater implications for him than it does another woman. So, that's not to say, oh no, if it's a man on the other side of the table, ask for a woman, but that may be one factor that can make a difference.
Um, Thank you. Is the motherhood penalty more likely to impact movement across company, less likely to secure a new job if the prospective employee believes the woman is about to be unavailable due to maternity leave? And if so, how to handle that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to speak out of turn because I'm not all that familiar with this literature, but I mean, my understanding and Horacio, correct me if I'm wrong if you have knowledge of this, but I do believe that women incur more of a penalty by switching organizations or industries than trying to work their way up within the same organization. You have a proven track record
Yeah.
with people who know you. So if people don't know you, haven't worked with you yet, and you show up pregnant, then that is going to raise more questions, is my
Yeah.
understanding.
And even anecdotally, just the people saying she's at that age. I've already heard
Yeah.
that, right? She's at that age when she's about to have kids. So we need to think about this big project. Are we going to staff that lady on this project? And then you said, right, the attribution of projects that are more likely to be promotable, right? Especially at that age, but you might have a great consequence of that curve you saw for the 90 that you shared, sorry, on the 90%. So yeah, I would argue that while I don't have conclusive data, I have anecdotal and experience with some of that. Yeah. I think we're about done with our time, but there's so many questions. And I myself, as you saw, I got so excited. I wanted to ask so much because the topic's so close to my heart. But I just wanted to thank you. I know you're busy and you have 1,000 things to do. So thank you for carving the time to teach us what's the new way of looking at gender pay and not fall into the trap of thinking it's just a choice problem or negotiation, but there are institutional issues that we can do, if I'm understanding correctly, and to move, like the UK-US example, to facilitate and promote more equality in the workplace and helping everyone negotiate better. Laura,
Thank you
thank you.
so much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yes, it was very welcome seeing you again. Cheers and have a
Okay,
wonderful day.
bye-bye.
For everyone else, I'm going to be sharing our closing slides as we normally do, just to show some resources. Someone asked if the slides will be made available. So on that note, we are going to be looking into that. We're going to check if we can share those slides. Otherwise, the recording will be made available to you. So, oops, I'm actually opening the wrong slides over here. I'm sorry. Very quickly, where are they? Here. And so just to thank our speakers so far. So as you saw for the NCMC webinar series, right now we've had Max Bazerman, Eric Weichens, and Laura Kray talking about practice, research, and books. So we're diversifying a bit the webinar series based on the feedback of some people who reached out to see different ways of looking at negotiation in general. We're gonna, on the next one, we're gonna have Professor Brian Gunia talking about his book, Better Through Barter. Very interesting angle into negotiation. So I hope you register and you will find in that. I already heard that. I met him, but I actually never seen him present. So I'm looking forward to that. But I heard some people, he's actually a great presenter as well. So that always helps to get good content with great presentation skills. So I'm actually looking forward to that next one. So that's coming in next month, as you can see. If you want to watch past webinars, they're all recorded. They're all on our website. Usually it takes a couple of weeks before we format it properly. So the Laura Kray's one will actually come probably in a couple of weeks. We'll announce it on LinkedIn once it does. We actually got Brad Mello to join us in June. The exact date is still to be decided. But just so that you know, despite her youth, she was the winner of the MIT AI negotiation competition. So she created prompts and bots programming that eventually went to win this competition, which has thousands and thousands of negotiations among bots. And hers came out as the best one, competing with several professional houses and academics. So when she's there, she's literally going to pull the curtain on her prompt and show what did she put in there, so that we really start understanding better what some great negotiation advice can be and how that interacts with AI and bots, and how the interface between the two can lead to better negotiations. Hopefully that will be fascinating for everyone. And in October, again, date exactly to be decided, my mentor and professor, Bruce Patton, co-author of Getting to Yes and co-author of the Difficult Conversations book, will be joining us as well. I'm particularly excited about that because he was the one who introduced me to the field of negotiation. So very much looking forward to that. Here is just talking about AI, my paper about 1.5 years ago, which is more of a theoretical paper, so still relevant, got the Best Paper Award from the IJCC. So there'll be a presentation that I'll be delivering also on April 30th on behalf of the IGCC. So if you haven't seen yet the webinar, which there's already a version of it on the right side most QR code there for you, you can all watch this one that's coming on April 30th, not through INSEAD, through the IGCC. And feel free to ask any questions you want if you just joined there. Otherwise, here's some other resources for you to get a bit more on the topic. By the way, I'm writing yet a second one, much more specific on how to use AI to prepare for negotiations. Hopefully that will come out in a month or two. Latest cases, the Sheikh Zayed one, was actually picked up by the royalty of Abu Dhabi, and there was a presentation of the case to the royalty of Abu Dhabi of Sheikh Zayed as a negotiator. So that's how well that case reached out. And also we have the case of his negotiation stories in this book, Negotiators Who Changed the World, edited by my good friend Remy Smolinski. Remember the Negotiator Award Prize? We had Eric Weichens win it last year. We're going to be opening soon. Actually, we already soft opened the process for this year. So if you know anyone from our alumni community who you think deserves an award for being a great negotiator, who does things in a win-win fashion without using power, creating sustainable agreements, be it bilateral, multilateral, we're looking for these people. So either volunteer yourself, self-nominations are accepted, or please do ask others or nominate others on their behalf. The process is not too heavy, and so hopefully we will be able to generate a lot of success stories and share those success stories of our community on how can we become better win-win negotiators by also emulating others who are close to us and therefore realistically achievable as role models. And finally here, please do stay connected. This photo on the right there is from our INSEAD Negotiation Cup. So if you're an alumnus as well, we're going to be opening in June the registrations for the Negotiation Cup that we're going to run next semester. And if you would like to make a team of 3 alumni or students, feel free to do that. There are 2 categories, a student one and an open one, and we would love to see you in the competition as well. But this is our mailing list generically for the NCMC. With that, thank you so very much, everyone, for showing up. I hope to see you in the next webinar or in any other of the upcoming NCMC activities. Wishing you a wonderful day. NYE, thank you very much once again for organizing it all. Bye-bye.